The first-class cabin was quiet in the way only money could buy. Voices low, movements measured, a world insulated from the noise and chaos spilling to the rest of the airport. Champagne flutes caught the overhead light. A violin track whispered from hidden speakers, and attendants glided like stage performers on polished aisles. Passengers reclined with practiced ease, their faces glowing with the smug assurance of those who had long since stopped worrying about legroom or baggage fees. It was into this carefully cultivated sanctuary that he walked. Marcus Hayes, broad-shouldered, impeccably tailored, the quiet authority of someone who had learned long ago that he didn't need to announce himself. His suit was navy, cut sharp, with no ostentation except for a subtle platinum tie clip shaped like a bar. He carried only a single leather satchel, worn from years of use, polished by time and care rather than status symbols. His wristwatch, discreet, slim, and devastatingly expensive, peeked only occasionally from beneath his cuff, a glint of authority almost too subtle to notice. He didn't rush. He didn't swagger. He moved down the jet bridge and into the galley of the aircraft with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. But for some people, that was proof enough. "Sir," the voice snapped like a whip. Blocking the narrow passage into the first-class cabin stood a flight attendant, mid-40s, platinum blonde, bob cut sharp as glass, her uniform tailored within an inch of its fabric. The name tag read Brenda. Her expression was not one of welcome. It was a checkpoint. Her cold eyes swept him from shoes to shoulders, pausing on the simplicity of his satchel, lingering on the brown of his skin, as though it was an anomaly to be catalogued. "First class is up here," Marcus said, his voice calm, courteous. Brenda's lips pursed. "May I see your boarding pass?" It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. Marcus lifted his phone, the screen displaying his digital pass. Seat 1A. Bright, clear, undeniable. He held it steady, meeting her gaze without a flicker of irritation. Brenda leaned closer, squinting theatrically. She drew the sound out, her brow tightening. "I think there's a mistake. This can't be right." Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, their attention pricked by the confrontation. The cabin had been still a moment ago. Now it hummed with a predatory curiosity. "No mistake," Marcus said evenly. "Your colleague at the gate scanned it. 1A. Brenda gave a laugh. Sharp, brittle, and loud enough for others to hear. "Sometimes the system glitches. Happens all the time. Economy is that way." She gestured down the aisle with the kind of dismissive flourish usually reserved for lost tourists. A low ripple of amusement stirred in the rows behind her. A man in a golf polo snorted. A woman with oversized sunglasses leaned toward her neighbor and whispered. Someone chuckled under their breath. Marcus didn't flinch. "My seat is 1A, he repeated, his voice steady as stone. "You can scan the code if you like." Brenda's smile curdled. "Honey," she said. The word dipped in condescension sharp enough to draw blood. "I've been doing this 15 years. I can tell when there's been a mix-up. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Her hand twitched as though she might guide him physically down the aisle. The implication was clear. "You don't belong here. Move along." Marcus stood still. He did not raise his voice. He did not step back. His stillness was louder than any outburst could have been. Behind him, more first-class passengers began boarding. Their murmurs grew, a rising tide of impatience and interest. An older man with a blazer cleared his throat loudly, irritated at the bottleneck. A younger passenger angled his phone discreetly, recording. Brenda's lips tightened. She turned, snapping her fingers at a younger attendant hovering nervously near the galley. Chloe, her badge red. Her eyes were wide, darting between the two, as though silently begging for the situation to dissolve before it exploded. "Chloe, go get Robert," Brenda ordered. "Tell him we've got a boarding error." Chloe hesitated, then scurried down the aisle. Marcus's eyes never left Brenda's. "Why don't you scan it?" he said calmly, holding the phone a little closer. For a heartbeat, Brenda didn't move. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, she snatched the device from his hand, a small, deliberate aggression. She swiped it beneath her handheld scanner. Beep. Green light. Seat 1A. Confirmed. A crack splintered through her composure. For a flicker of a second, she faltered. But prejudice once awakened is a furnace. It demands fuel. Admitting fault wasn't in her nature. "The system's faulty today," she said briskly, handing the phone back without meeting his eyes. "That seat's already taken. You'll need to speak to the gate agent." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Passengers leaned further into the spectacle. One woman whispered, "Wow," half amused, half scandalized. Another man smirked and shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable," though whether at Marcus or at the attendant wasn't clear. Marcus slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. His voice remained calm. "The seat is empty. I'll take it." Before Brenda could retort, a man appeared in the aisle. Robert, the purser, his silver hair thinning, his face etched with weary authority. He moved like a judge summoned to a petty dispute, already certain of the verdict. "What's the issue here?" he asked, though his eyes were on Brenda, not Marcus. "This passenger," Brenda said, spitting the word with disdain, "insists he's in 1A. The seat's taken. It's a glitch." Robert turned to Marcus, his expression heavy with rehearsed sympathy. "Sir, I know this must be frustrating. These things happen sometimes. Why don't we step back to the gate and sort this out? We can't hold up boarding." It was a performance, not an inquiry. A neat, practiced maneuver to remove the problem, not solve it. Behind them, the aisle clogged with waiting passengers. Impatience thickened the air. The humiliation was no longer private. It was a spectacle, a slow-motion unmasking stage for an unwilling audience. Marcus looked from Brenda's smirk, to Robert's weary dismissal, to Chloe's downcast eyes. He felt the weight of a pattern he had known all his life. The roomful of privilege, the whispered doubt, the unspoken accusation that he was out of place. But this time was different. He had built empires. He had commanded boardrooms where billions shifted on his words. He had rewritten entire industries with decisions made in silence. And here, in this narrow aisle, he felt the old burn of dismissal, but layered over with something colder: responsibility. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about a disease in a company he had quietly acquired. And diseases had to be cut out. Robert spread his hands. "Sir, we can resolve this if you'll just—" Marcus interrupted without raising his voice. "My seat is 1A. The steel in his tone froze Robert mid-sentence. Passengers leaned closer. Someone muttered, "Damn." Brenda's cheeks flushed red. "That's it," she snapped. "You're creating a disturbance. Security risk." Her voice rose, sharp and shrill, meant to shift the narrative. From crew misconduct to passenger threat. "Captain," Robert said quickly, reaching for the intercom. "We have a situation in the cabin." Within moments, the cockpit door opened. Captain Miller stepped out, tall, broad, gray mustache bristling with authority. His eyes swept the scene, barely resting on Marcus before turning to his crew. "What's the problem?" Brenda jumped in eagerly. "He forced his way into the cabin, won't comply with instructions, doesn't have a valid ticket." The lie was outrageous, but it rolled off her tongue like scripture. The captain turned to Marcus. He didn't ask for evidence. He didn't check the manifest. He didn't scan the ticket himself. "Sir, you have two options," he said, voice heavy with finality. "Take a seat in economy or deplane. We'll rebook you on a later flight." What it going to be? The air in the cabin went still. The balance of power was clear. A united wall of crew against one passenger. Passengers held their breath. Phones recorded. Brenda's lips curved in triumph. And Marcus Hayes, quiet, unbending, eyes like tempered steel, reached into his pocket. Not for his boarding pass. For his phone. He pressed one button. Lifted it to his ear. His first word was quiet, but it carried the weight of an executioner's blade. "James, if you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel." For the crew, the matter was settled. For Marcus Hayes, it had only just begun. He sat there in the galley, phone pressed lightly against his ear, his expression calm. Too calm. Brenda folded her arms, smirking as if she had won some small war. Robert exhaled, relieved the situation would soon be behind them. The captain had already turned, dismissing the matter with the certainty of a man whose word was law. But Marcus's voice was soft, deliberate, cutting through the recycled cabin air like a razor. James, he said. On the other end of the line, halfway across the country, James Whitaker sat bolt upright at his desk in Ethereum Dynamics Command Center. He recognized the tone instantly, measured, icy, threaded with the kind of quiet fury that always preceded seismic shifts. Marcus, James replied, already pulling up system dashboards with muscle memory. Talk to me? Marcus's eyes never left Brenda's. I'm on flight 214. Orifly, first class cabin, LAX to JFK. We have a code Indigo. There was silence for half a beat, then the sound of furious typing. Confirmed. James said, his voice clipped. All business now. What's your directive? Ground this aircraft. Effective immediately. Even as he spoke, passengers were still shuffling into the cabin, unaware that the airliner they were boarding had just become a corporate crime scene. Brenda rolled her eyes dramatically, muttering under her breath, calling his lawyer. No doubt. Robert gave her a tight, nervous smile, already turning his attention back to boarding. The captain had vanished into the cockpit, confident the situation was resolved. But Marcus Hayes had just lit a fuse that would stretch far beyond this aisle. Ripples of unease. Within minutes, the cockpit lit up with a flashing alert. Ground stop order. Priority Alpha. Captain Miller frowned, stabbing at the screen. What the hell? Robert, still in the galley, was startled by the sudden crackle of the intercom. Tower to Orifly 214. Hold position at gate. Do not close doors. Ground stop order in effect. Repeat, hold position. The words carried across the cabin. Heads turned. Passengers froze mid-sentence. The serenity of first class curdled into confusion. What's going on? A woman in pearls demanded. Why are we stopped? A man muttered, tugging at his blazer. Phones lifted discreetly again. Some filmed the crew's tightening faces, sensing that something unusual, something worth posting, was happening. Brenda stiffened, her earlier smugness wobbling. She shot Robert a look, her voice dropping into a hiss. What is this? Why are we stopped? Robert didn't answer. His eyes darted to Marcus, who was still seated in the galley, phone in hand, gaze unyielding. The quiet certainty in his posture sent a shiver down Robert's spine. Passengers began to see. The passengers weren't stupid. They might have been entitled, amused, even cruel a few minutes earlier, but they could read a shift in the air. The man who'd been mocked and dismissed now sat unmoved, a pillar in the storm, while the crew scrambled like startled children. What's happening? Someone whispered. Who is he? Asked another. The laughter that filled the cabin minutes ago was gone, replaced by murmurs, darting glances and the first threads of doubt. Chloe, the junior attendant, stood frozen by the bulkhead. She looked at Marcus's calm face, then at Brenda's reddening one, and something inside her twisted. She knew. She didn't know the details, but she knew. This wasn't a man pretending. This wasn't a glitch. Something far bigger was unfolding, and she was standing on the wrong side of it. The call expands. Status, Marcus murmured into the phone. James's voice came back, low and efficient. LAX tower has acknowledged. Orifly 214 is officially grounded. Jet bridge ordered to remain in place. FAA liaison notified. I've pinged David Chun and the senior Orifly board. Conference line is spinning up now. ETA, 5 minutes. Do you want the wider fleet locked? Marcus's eyes flicked to Brenda, whose lips were trembling now, though she tried to mask it with bluster. He let the question hang, deliberate. Then he said, Not yet. This flight is a lesson. Passengers could only hear fragments, the hum of his voice, the occasional sharp word like indigo or board. Each fragment made the tension grow, stretching thinner and thinner until the whole cabin buzzed with barely suppressed dread. Brenda doubles down. Brenda, unable to bear the silence, snapped. Sir, if you don't stop this nonsense, I'll have security escort you out myself. You are not. Her voice faltered, because in that instant, the intercom blared again. Captain Miller, this is Tower. Be advised, the ground stop order originates from Orifly corporate headquarters. Authority code, Hayes. The name landed like a stone in a still pond. The captain's face drained of color. Robert's knees nearly buckled. Chloe clapped a hand over her mouth. Passengers looked around, bewildered. Hayes? Some recognized the name immediately. Others pulled out their phones, searching. Within seconds, whispers spread. Marcus Hayes? Isn't he the... Ethereum Dynamics. Wait, does he own? Brenda's face went white. The junior attendant breaks. Chloe stepped forward, voice trembling. Mr. Hayes? Aye. But Marcus lifted a hand gently, silencing her without a word. His calm was more commanding than any shout. Brenda turned on her junior colleague with venom. Don't you dare. Enough. Marcus's single word cut through the cabin. Quiet, but absolute. The silence that followed was suffocating. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Even the engine seemed to hum softer. Passengers shift sides. The man in the golf polo, who had snickered earlier, cleared his throat awkwardly and looked down at his phone. The woman in pearls pursed her lips, eyes darting to Marcus with something that resembled guilt. One by one, the smirks, the laughs, the dismissive expressions melted into shame or awe. No one laughed now. For the first time, passengers saw clearly. This wasn't a man trying to force his way into first class. This was the man who owned it. The mood in the cockpit. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miller gripped the radio. Tower, repeat. Did you say... Hayes? Affirmative, the tower replied coolly. Authority, Marcus Hayes. Override priority alpha. Hold position until instructed otherwise. The captain's hand trembled. He wasn't a man used to fear, but he had just realized the one passenger he'd been ready to throw off his plane could ground every aircraft in his fleet. The weight of silence. Marcus ended the call with a simple 5 minutes. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't move. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any tirade could have been. Brenda's face was ashen. Robert's lips worked soundlessly, and Chloe's eyes brimmed with tears she couldn't hide. Passengers sat frozen, caught between awe and shame. And Marcus Hayes, the man they had laughed at, humiliated, dismissed as an imposter, sat calmly in his seat, radiating the unshakable authority of someone who could dismantle an empire with a whisper. The plane had the stillness of a courtroom that hadn't been called to order yet. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the compressors under the floor seemed to soften their drone, as if the aircraft itself wanted to hear what would happen next. Captain Miller stood halfway between cockpit and cabin, a man suspended over a chasm that had opened without warning. He kept glancing at the overhead panel, where nothing had changed, and at Marcus Hayes, where everything had. Robert, the purser, hovered near the galley, wringing his hands so hard the skin had gone pale. Brenda's face had drained of color, the artificial warmth of her smile gone, her mouth pinched to keep it from trembling. Chloe stood with her back to a bulkhead, clutching a folded manifest like a life vest. From the jet bridge came a staccato of urgent footsteps, the metallic ring of hard soles on ribbed aluminum. It grew louder, closer, then spilled into the doorway with the full, human chaos of panic. 3 suits burst aboard, breathless, seams creased by a sprint. At their center was a man in his 50s with silvering hair and a half-undone tie, the sheen of sweat bright across his brow. His eyes scanned in jerks. Galley, cabin, crew, until they locked on Marcus like a ship seeing harbor lights in a storm. Mr. Hayes, the man said, swallowing air in dread. Sir, the ripple that went to the cabin was visible. Spine straightening, phones lowering, the collective tilt of heads that happens when a secret gets a name. David Chun, Chief Operating Officer. Didn't look at the captain or the purser or the senior attendant. He went straight to 1A and stopped short, the way you stop at a cliff's edge. Sir, he said again, I am profoundly sorry. We received the Indigo alert and... Marcus didn't rise. He only turned his head, and the COO's cascade of apologies dammed up in his throat. Mr. Chun, Marcus said, voice even, each syllable placed as precisely as a chess piece. We will address your apology after the facts. Behind him, Brenda made a small sound, half gasp, half denial. The man in 2C, who had earlier snickered into his champagne, set the flute down with hands that suddenly didn't feel steady. The woman in 2A took off her sunglasses like a penitent removing a crown. David drew a breath, recalibrating. Of course. I've ordered a hold, notified the tower, pulled security. The tower notified you, Marcus corrected softly. It wasn't a rebuke so much as an audit spoken aloud. Let's not confuse reaction with leadership. David nodded once, humbled. Yes, sir. He turned stiffly to face the crew, every line of his body reasserting hierarchy as if his spine were a flagpole. Who is the acting service lead on this cabin? Brenda stepped forward, trying for composure and finding none. I am, she managed, Senior Flight Attendant Brenda Hollis. David's eyes touched her name tag, only long enough to acknowledge it. Explain what happened. Brenda inhaled, bracing herself. The passenger, Mr. Hayes, attempted to enter first class without a valid booking. There's been a system glitch this morning. When he refused to comply, Stop. David didn't raise his voice, but his palm cut the air as if severing rope. Do you understand the word record? Brenda blinked. Sir, the device in your hand, he said, pointing to her scanner. It records. Scans are time-stamped. Manifests are time-synced. Cabin cameras record audio at doors by law. If you intend to lie right now, make a historic one. It will be replayed for the board. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with the consequences of every sentence she could say next. Brenda's lips parted, closed. She stared at her scanner like it had betrayed her. Chloe spoke before she could. His pass scanned green, she said, voice small but clear. Seat 1A. I saw a flash. David's head turned. He really looked at Chloe, saw the tremble, the guilt, the youth. Name. Chloe Martinez, she said, junior attendant. And you verified 1A? Yes. Her throat moved. I didn't insist. I should have. David nodded, not kindly, not unkindly, simply mapping the truth. He turned to the purser. Mr. Robert Miller, the purser whispered. You are floor lead. Did you check the manifest, Mr. Miller? David asked. Robert's eyes flicked to Brenda. Habit as reflex. No, sir. I trusted my lead. You outsource your eyes, David said, with a crispness that suggested he wasn't the kind of executive who liked repeating mistakes he'd paid for. He turned to the captain. Captain Harrow. Miller. The captain corrected reflexively, then winced at the unfortunate rhyme. Did you independently verify the passenger's status before issuing an ultimatum? David asked. The captain's jaw tightened. No, I acted based on crew reports to maintain safety and schedule. David's mouth made a line. You acted to maintain inertia. A low murmur fluttered across the seats. That word, inertia, shone like a label stuck on the night's entire chain of events. In 1B, the passenger who'd smirked before adjusted his cuffs and tried to become interesting to no one. The woman behind him clasped her hands and stared straight ahead like a student willing herself invisible. The crowd that had been an audience was becoming a jury, and juries often remember their own laughter at sentencing. David returned to Marcus's eyeline. Sir, would you like to continue privately, or do you want this recorded in the cabin? In the cabin, Marcus said. No more whispers. Everyone who watched the problem will watch the answers. He looked past David and finally, fully at the crew, each person held up by his gaze long enough to be measured. Ms. Hollis, he said. Brenda's name sounded different in his mouth, less like a name, more like a case file. Her shoulders squared in a last bid for dignity. You had tools, Marcus said. A scanner, a manifest, a junior attendant who tried to speak. You bypassed all three to play to an audience. When facts contradicted your story, you scaled your story. You used volume in place of procedure. Brenda's chin quivered. I made a mistake. You made a method, Marcus corrected. The mistake came later, when you chose the same method again under scrutiny. He let the sentence rest. You will hand over your credentials at the door. Her breath hitched. For a heartbeat, she looked like she might argue or beg or collapse. In the end, she did none of those. She nodded, stiff, mechanical, like a lever being thrown. The jet bridge door had barely sealed behind the disgraced crew when the silence settled like a shroud. It wasn't the hush of confusion anymore. It was Judgment Day's silence, heavy and expectant. Every passenger knowing instinctively that they were sitting in a place where something irreversible was about to happen. Marcus Hayes didn't move at first. He sat calmly in 1A, the same seat they had tried to deny him, leather satchel on his lap, hands folded neatly as though he were presiding over a board meeting rather than a cabin full of strangers. The silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. He was letting it sink in. Every second stretched, making the absence of Brenda's voice, Robert's excuses, and the captain's authority feel like missing walls in a collapsed building. Finally, Marcus stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone smooth, precise, as though each word had been sanded of excess until only truth remained. "You have witnessed a case study." Heads tilted, eyes sharpened, some passengers leaned forward. Others shrank into their seats, ashamed of how quickly they had joined in the spectacle earlier. Marcus let the words hang. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping from one end of the cabin to the other. The room followed his movement, like a compass needle following north, dissecting the failure. "The role of a flight attendant," he began, "is not simply to serve food or demonstrate safety protocols. They are ambassadors of a brand, the first and last impression you have of the company you've paid to trust with your life." He paused, locking eyes with a businessman who had earlier chuckled at Brenda's barbed tone. The man looked away, adjusting his watch as though it had suddenly grown heavy. "And yet," Marcus continued, "today you watched as an attendant use authority, as a weapon rather than service. You watched a purser, entrusted with leadership, choose complicity over courage. You watched a captain, granted the highest authority in aviation, use it without a single moment of inquiry. And you watched a junior crew member, who knew the truth, silence herself out of fear." Chloe flinched at his words, but Marcus's gaze softened briefly on her, the kind of softness that said he was noting not just failure, but possibility. "This," Marcus said, letting the words slice through the recycled air, "is not an inconvenience. It is a systemic disease. And diseases, left untreated, spread." The courtroom atmosphere. The cabin had transformed. What was once a luxury lounge in the sky now felt like a tribunal chamber. Passengers straightened unconsciously, as if waiting their turn to testify. The man in the golf polo cleared his throat nervously. The woman in pearls pressed her lips into a thin, regretful line. Even David Chun, COO of Orifly, stood as still as a schoolboy caught in a lecture, pen poised uselessly over a blank notebook. He didn't dare speak, not yet. Marcus walked a few steps down the aisle, every movement deliberate, his presence filling the space more powerfully than any captain's announcement ever could. "Let's be clear," he said. "This was not a misunderstanding. It was a sequence of conscious choices. Assumptions made because of how I looked, lies told to protect those assumptions, authority wielded to enforce them, and silence from those who could have intervened but chose not to." His words were scalpel strokes, cutting not to wound, but to reveal, turning toward the passengers. "And you," he said suddenly, looking at the passengers. Several people stiffened. A few phones, still held discreetly at chest height, lowered instinctively. "You watched," Marcus said, voice calm but carrying the weight of truth. "Some of you laughed. Some of you recorded, hoping for spectacle. Few of you questioned. That silence, too, is part of the system. Prejudice is not only what is spoken, it is also what is allowed." The cabin shifted uneasily. A ripple of shame crossed the faces of those who had smirked, whispered, or enjoyed the humiliation as entertainment. Marcus did not linger on them. He moved back toward his seat, reclaiming 1A with the quiet dominance of a man who had always owned it. He rested a hand lightly on the headrest, posture upright, gaze steady, delivering judgment. "The individuals directly responsible," Marcus said, "have already been removed. Their careers in this industry ended not because of a single mistake, but because of a pattern that revealed itself in 10 minutes of arrogance." His eyes flicked toward the jet bridge door where Brenda, Robert, and Captain Miller had disappeared moments earlier. His voice didn't harden, It didn't need to. The absence of those names in the cabin was verdict enough. But accountability does not end with individuals, he went on. Accountability lives in systems. Orifly systems failed. Training, oversight, escalation, culture. And I will not permit a company under my ownership to operate with rot in its foundation. David Chen swallowed hard, his pen slipping in his sweaty grip. Orders for reform. Mr. Chun, Marcus said without looking at him, you'll begin a full audit of every training protocol and every hiring practice. You will reopen every passenger complaint of the last 2 years involving discrimination or misconduct. You will create a direct, anonymous reporting line to bypass weak managers, and you will deliver those findings to my desk in 5 days. Yes, sir, Chin stammered. His voice cracked on the sir. Passengers of this flight, Marcus said, shifting his gaze back to the cabin, you will not leave empty-handed. You were subjected to a delay, to discomfort, and to an incident that should never have occurred on any aircraft. A ripple of anticipation ran through the cabin. You will each receive a full refund, Marcus continued, and a complimentary round trip in your chosen cabin class. Not as charity, but as restitution. The gasp was audible. A businessman exhaled in disbelief. The woman in pearls blinked, stunned. Someone muttered, "He can do that?" He could, and he just had. Symbolic claiming of authority. Finally, Marcus lowered himself into seat 1A. He adjusted his cuffs with unhurried grace, placed a satchel in the overhead bin, and fastened his belt. The act was mundane, but in the context of the last hour, it was monumental. The seat that had been contested ground, denied with prejudice, lied about, and defended with arrogance was his by right, not just by ticket, not just by wealth, by fact, by ownership, by truth. The silence that followed was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of awe. Closing of the act. The intercom clicked alive again, David Chen's voice now subdued but resolute. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, this is Orifly's chief operating officer. On behalf of the airline, I apologize for what you have witnessed today. We failed. We failed our standards, our promises, and our passengers. That failure has been addressed. We thank you for your patience. A new crew will be boarding shortly, and we will be on our way. A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. For the first time since the boarding began, the atmosphere carried not tension, but a strange mixture of relief and respect. In 1B, the man who had smirked earlier cleared his throat. Quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Guess we were wrong about him." Marcus heard it. He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because in the space of an hour, he had turned humiliation into revelation, a cabin into a courtroom, and a single seat into a throne. And everyone in that aircraft now understood. Marcus Hayes did not argue for respect. He required it. The engines hummed. Idling against the weight of the ground stopped. The aircraft hadn't moved an inch, but inside the cabin it felt like they had already traveled 1,000 miles. The disgraced crew was gone, escorted down the jet bridge by airport security. A replacement crew waited just beyond the door, their eyes sharp, their posture composed. But no one rushed forward yet. Everyone waited for Marcus Hayes. The passengers shift. The cabin had transformed from a theater of humiliation into something else entirely. The same passengers who had whispered, chuckled, or filmed when Brenda first sneered now sat upright. Their expressions altered. Shame burned in some faces. Awe in others. A man in a navy suit cleared his throat softly, as if rehearsing an apology he'd never deliver. A young woman 2 rows back had tears in her eyes. Tears not for Marcus, but for herself, for realizing she had done nothing when silence had felt safest. Every set of eyes tracked Marcus as though gravity itself had shifted to orbit around him. Marcus issues the final directives. David Chun, still standing near the galley with his notepad damp from sweat, leaned in slightly. "Mr. Hayes, sir, shall we release the ground stop?" Marcus turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing not in anger but in deliberation. "Not yet," he said, voice low and firm. "Not until the lesson has weight." Chin nodded quickly, scribbling as though the words themselves were binding contract clauses. Marcus rose from his seat once more, adjusting his jacket with calm precision. When he spoke, it wasn't only to Chun, it was to the cabin, the cockpit, the entire airline whose culture now lay in ruins at his feet. "This flight will be remembered," he said, voice carrying without effort. "But whether it is remembered as a scandal or a turning point depends on what happens next." Passengers leaned in, hungry for each word. Even the replacement crew, purser at the front, attendant behind her, stood straighter, absorbing every syllable as doctrine, the shape of reform. Marcus turned to Chun. "Orifly will not treat this as an isolated incident. Beginning immediately, we are rebuilding from the ground up, hiring, training, discipline, bias protocols, escalation procedures. And when we say safety, it will mean safety for every passenger, not just those who look the part." Chin nodded furiously, his pen scratching across the page. Marcus continued, "Passengers who fly with Orifly must know they are seen, respected, and valued. That begins with transparency. Every one of you," he gestured across the cabin, "will receive documentation of how this failure occurred and how we will ensure it cannot happen again. Not a press release, a report. You are witnesses. You will be our auditors." A murmur of approval swept through the cabin. A businessman raised his eyebrows in surprised respect. A mother traveling with her teenage son gave Marcus a small, almost reverent nod. Restitution. "And as for you," Marcus said, addressing the passengers directly, "you will receive more than words. Each of you will receive a full refund of this flight, plus a complimentary round trip in the cabin you purchased. That is not generosity. That is restitution. Your time and trust were stolen. I intend to return both." The words landed like a bomb. Relief washed through the rows. For the first time since boarding, shoulders loosened, tension exhaled. The woman in pearls even clapped softly before catching herself, embarrassed. But Marcus didn't smile. His expression remained steady, grave. This was not a victory lap. It was an audit closing, claiming his seat. Finally, Marcus sat once more in 1A. He placed his leather satchel in the overhead bin and folded his hands over his lap. The symbolic act was almost cinematic. The very seat they had tried to deny him, now reclaimed in front of every witness. It was not just a seat anymore. It was proof, authority, consequence. The cabin exhaled with him. The replacement crew, the new purser, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet confidence, stepped forward. She bent slightly at the waist, a gesture of respect without servility. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "we are honored to serve you. Please let us know if there is anything you or your fellow passengers require." Marcus inclined his head. "Safety, professionalism, nothing more, nothing less." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady. She turned to her team. "Prepare the cabin for departure." The new attendants moved with crisp efficiency, every gesture clean, every glance professional. It was as if the entire cabin sighed in relief at their competence. The captain's silence. From the cockpit came no protest, no excuses. Captain Miller was gone. In his place, a reserve captain had quietly boarded during the commotion, his expression calm, his posture deferential. He gave Marcus a brief nod to the cockpit door before sealing himself inside. The symbolism was not lost on the passengers. Authority had shifted, and the aircraft was once again in safe hands. Passenger reflection. As the new crew distributed water and checked seat belts, passengers exchanged glances, hesitant at first, then more direct. Some offered Marcus small nods of respect. Others whispered apologies under their breath. The earlier smugness, the smirks, the voyeuristic phones gone. What remained was something closer to reverence. In 1B, the man who had once snickered couldn't seem to meet Marcus's eyes. He busied himself with his phone, though the screen was black. Across the aisle, the woman who had rolled her eyes earlier leaned forward just enough to whisper, "Thank you." Marcus didn't reply. His silence said enough. Takeoff. The jet bridge retracted with a heavy thud. The engines rumbled, building to a low growl. The cabin lights dimmed, then brightened again. This time, there was no tension, no doubt. Order had been restored, not by protocol, not by the captain, but by the man in 1A. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Marcus finally allowed himself to exhale. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply reached for his tablet, pulling up a technical proposal he had meant to review before boarding. For a moment, he read, but his gaze drifted to the window, watching the tarmac lights blur into streaks as the plane accelerated. Reflection. There was no thrill in what had happened, no satisfaction in humiliation, only weariness and resolve, because this was never about a seat. It was about a culture, a system, a disease. And for Marcus Hayes, ownership was not a privilege. It was a responsibility. What he had done here was not revenge. It was surgery. Painful, necessary, precise. The plane lifted into the California night. Beneath it, Los Angeles glowed, sprawling and restless. Inside, the passengers sat in silence, each one carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. And Marcus Hayes, calm and unshaken, sat in 1A, the seat that had been denied him, the seat he now occupied without question, not because he fought for it, because it was his. Closing image. As the aircraft pierced the clouds, the cabin lights dimmed, and quiet fell once again. A quiet not of humiliation, but of respect. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines wash over him. Tomorrow, reforms would begin. Reports would be written. Policies rewritten. Careers ended and others begun. But tonight, this moment, one truth hung in the recycled air of the cabin like scripture. True authority does not shout. It does not demand. It simply acts, and the world rearranges itself around it. And in 1A, Marcus Hayes had done exactly that. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.